Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Gemma King, an Australian professor of French and cinema at the Australian National University. She's here to discuss a word that, despite meaning at its root an ability to speak French, is now suffused with quite a bit of socio-political weight: Francophonie. All right. Welcome to Dr. Gemma King. Gemma, can you introduce yourself and tell me a little bit about your work and your research?
Yes, hello. Thank you for having me. I am a senior lecturer in French studies at the Australian National University in Canberra, Australia. I spend most of my time teaching the French language, but my research is on French cinema and sort of broader ideas of transnational cinema in the world.
Awesome. And we have known each other for a long time. We met back in Paris in 2011, I think, and you were studying cinema.
We were babies.
We were babies, I know. And I remember you were studying cinema and I was studying literature, but we were both looking at this distinction, and you've continued to examine that in your work between French and Francophone. And Francophone is the word that I would like to discuss with you today. So let's start things off with the simplest definition we can find. So like the dictionary definition of Francophone, the adjective form, it basically means someone who speaks French, right?
Yes. Or, anything to do with the French-speaking world.
Okay. But then there is this sort of socio-political layer to the word as well, isn't there?
Yes, it's actually a really simple and a really complex term at the same time. There are sort of multiple political layers that exist within it, and there's also a definition, sort of a binary definition between Francophone with a capital F and Francophone with a lowercase f, and they technically mean different things.
Okay, so what does each of those words mean then?
So Francophonie with a lowercase f just refers in a general sense to the French-speaking world, whereas Francophonie with a capital F comes from this political construction that we got around the mid-20th century, soon after the sort of wave of decolonization that occurred in the French-speaking world. So, I know that you know this very well, but obviously France was a major colonial power in the 19th and 20th centuries, before that as well, but especially in the 19th and in the first half of the 20th century. And then in the 1950s and the 1960s, we had this huge wave of decolonial movements. We had the Algerian War, we had the Indochina War, and we also had a number of sort of peaceful referenda of independence from France. And so a huge part of Northern and Western Africa and Southeast Asia gained independence from French rule. And France was sort of reeling from this process, obviously. And in 1970, the sort of French-speaking world, or a large collection of countries that speak France and were part of the French Empire, founded this sort of Francophone UN, if you like, or a Francophone EU, called the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. So the Francophonie, with a capital F, is literally a diplomatic union of French-speaking nations.
These are nations that are then linked through their language, but then also through this colonial history and this political history, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
And so actually not every nation that was part of the French Empire is an official member of the OIF. For example, Algeria is not interested in being in a Francophone diplomatic network. And so they're an obvious outlier, but there are other countries that aren't involved. And then there are also other countries that are members but weren't specifically under French rule, but they have a complex sort of history with France. But for the most part, yes, this is a network of countries that were colonized by France.
Okay. And I think when we look at this word francophone, and when we look also at just French speakers in France who are not speakers of this major scare quotes here, standard French, which is, French from France, the French that we learned in our mine happened to be from the 1980s textbooks when we were learning French in school. There's almost this value judgment on one's ability to speak French as close to that standard model as possible. And, French being heavily protected by, the Académie Française with their immortal defensors of the French language. I'm not making this up. I know you know this. You have this high sense of wanting to protect the French language. And then you also have all of these nations of people for whom French is their native language. And there's almost this value judgment based on how they speak the language.
Yes, absolutely. That's essential to this concept. And in a way, the idea of the Francophonie is really inclusive because it acknowledges, at its foundation that the French language is not synonymous with the French nation and that French is a global lingua franca and is spoken in many different spaces. And obviously those variations have really impacted the language itself. So there are many different dialects of French, and many of those are also spoken in France due to the history of Francophone immigration around the world. And that diversity is really built into the concept of Francophonie. But at the same time, there is absolutely this sort of hierarchical binary notion of France and the rest of the French-speaking world. And even if it's not intended as such, the implication is sort of a West and the rest kind of connotation that, France is the center of the world. And like you said, the Académie Française is the summit of French culture and the norms of metropolitan France and French are to be aspired to. And then there's everything else. And so there are some really troubling dimensions to this term, Francophonie.
Absolutely. And I definitely want to get into those. I do want to say for anyone listening to this podcast who isn't as much of a language nerd as Gemma and I are, French as a language the great they, have been attempting to standardize it for a very, very, very long time. And they succeeded in a way that you don't see standardization in other languages around the world. And, that's in large part because you had this philosophical wave in the 18th century of folks. You had Rousseau, who was talking a lot about equality. And then you also had Diderot, who was trying to write a whole dictionary of French as it was spoken that day, in those days. And there's been attempts to make a full dictionary of every single word in French that's continuing with the Académie Française today. That was the goal with which they were founded. Was to establish a full dictionary of the entire French language and every French word as it is used and as it is spoken. They are made up of 13 defensors of the French language. They're usually literary figures. They are dubbed the immortals. They have swords. It's very Napoleonic. It's also highly divisive, and there are some really famous writers who have refused to be part of the organization. But just to give you sort of an idea of the French language, it's not an impression that you're getting that the French are a little snooty about their language. That's sort of been built into the language and the structure of the politics surrounding language for a very, very, very long time. So I just wanted to zoom out a bit and talk about that.
It's really important. It's officially codified. There is an organization that decides if a word is French or if it is not.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors.
Hi, welcome to Wine Dine Caroline's Happy Hour. I'm Caroline Connor, a wine expert living in Lyon, France, where I am otherwise known as Wine Dine Caroline. Now, this isn't your average wine podcast. You can join me at Happy Hour, where I'll be meeting with friends, new and old, to hear a funny, stupid, or just all-out ridiculous story from their life. And then I'll pair a wine with it. Join us for belly laughs, silliness, and lots of love. Cheers!
And now, back to Navigating the French.
And there's an organization that decides if a word, once a word is French, if it's masculine or feminine. And that's always a big polemic. I mean, this year with COVID, we had to decide if COVID was going to be le Covid or la Covid. And it was indeed la Covid. And people started getting up in arms about that because usually English neologisms, so words borrowed from English into French, are by default masculine. And so there were all kinds of tongue-in-cheek references to the fact that this big looming pandemic was going to be feminine, and what was the essential femininity of that. But that's another conversation for another day.
Well, it is, but it does sort of show the extent to which the Académie Française seems to feel the need to reassert itself as an important institution. It's not that COVID would be the obvious gender of masculine. You can't just assume the Académie Française has to decide for you. It felt like a bit of a cheeky move, but perhaps I'm reading into it too much.
Well, that's our job.
It is interesting, though, about the Académie Française in that they have, despite the fact that they're highly centralized, highly normalized, highly concerned with metropolitan French as more correct than perhaps other dialects, there have been a number of members who aren't from France, who are francophone in the sense of being from other French-speaking countries. There haven't been many, but there was Léopold Senghor in the 60s, who was a Négritude Senegalese author and also became the president of Senegal post-decolonization. And there's a current member from Haiti, Denis Laferrière, who was born in Haiti, writes about Haiti in his literature, but has lived in Canada for the last 40 or so years, and so doesn't consider himself to be French at all, but has been accepted into this really exclusive French institution. Mm-hmm. So there's a little bit of an opening up that has been occurring in the last century.
Well, we're seeing that both at this very high level and at like a more general culture level. So, for example, in bookstores, you often see this distinction between French literature and Francophone literature just on the shelves. So, you'll see French, you'll see Francophone, you'll see English, you'll see German. So they actually draw this distinction, even though the books are being written in both languages. It's kind of like you would imagine if you were in the States and they had a section for American literature, and then they had a section for other Anglophone literature, and all of your Jane Austens and your William Shakespeare's were in this other section.
Yes.
Yeah. And there is this writer, a Strasbourg-based writer of Senegalese origin called Fatou Diome, who said that she noticed that when she began winning prizes, her novels were moved out of the Francophone section and into the French section. So it felt like she was being promoted. Is that sort of the sense that you still get from that division? And I know that you work in cinema. So is that the sense that you get, that sort of value judgment sense? And do you see the same thing in terms of cinema?
Yes and yes. So I'm sure that you're aware that in response to this problem, because it is a problem, that writers who were living and working in metropolitan France but were of migrant origin were not being categorized as littérature française. And there's absolutely a xenophobic dimension to that. And there actually was a manifesto that was published in Le Monde in 2007 called Pour une littérature monde au français, so for a world literature in French, that proposed this concept of a littérature monde that would encompass both French literature and Francophone literature, so that we wouldn't need to impose this binary between the two, that it would be the literature of the Francophone world. And so that was actually published as an open letter and a political manifestation that was signed by many French literary figures and authors, and did kind of have its moment. But the concept has really been taken up more and in the longer term in the cinema space. So a couple of years after that manifesto was published, a British film studies critic called Bill Marshall published an article called Cinéma Monde, and takes up this concept of the littérature monde in the cinema space, proposing this idea that we don't necessarily need to talk about French cinema versus Francophone cinema, but that we can talk about a cinéma monde that includes all Francophone cinema without making this binary distinction.
I've read that manifesto, and I also remember that there was a Franco-Congolese writer, Alain Mabankou, who told Le Monde that for a long time he had hoped that Francophone literature would integrate itself into French literature, and that with time he's realized that in fact the opposite should be true, that French literature is a national literature, and it's up to that literature to join the grand ensemble francophone, the great francophone gathering. So we've got the French who are extremely protective of their language, who are extremely protective of their culture. We have all of these different groups of people who speak the same language, but who have extremely different cultural backgrounds. And we're trying to conceive of art and culture across one language, but with all of these varying identities within it. I think we see this a lot raised in terms of what you were talking about, so the former French colonies. Does this same issue, when you were saying, West and the rest, did this same issue of Francophonie apply to European French-speaking nations like Switzerland or Belgium, or to North American French-speaking areas like Quebec?
That's a good question, because when we talk about the problems around the word francophonie, we're generally talking about those really obvious power imbalances of, the privileged French center and the sort of the global South, if we want to use that term. And that's really disenfranchising to those decolonized countries as well. But it also does ignore that kind of third dimension that we have at play, which is sort of equally or comparably privileged Western nations that also have this French history and Francophone culture. So that it doesn't tend to enter the conversation so much when we're talking about this issue. But that, of course, in its own way perpetuates a further concealing of the diversity of the French-speaking world. So, moving towards a discussion of a francophonie that includes France also allows us to start talking about, the cultural parallels and histories between, say, Canada and Senegal, or Switzerland and Mauritius, and sort of all of these potential connections that exist in the Francophone world that may not actually have anything to do with France at all. I mean, if we think of Dany Laferrière, that author I referred to before, his Francophone experience is transnational, but it's mostly between Haiti and Quebec.
And when we have these multiple cultures and these multiple experiences of francophonie, we're also often talking about, different dialects, different ways of speaking French, but also there's occasionally a multilingual aspect to it. So occasionally you'll have someone for whom French is their native language, but either they speak another language or the French that they speak has been touched, affected, morphed, changed by contact with another local language to where they or their parents or their grandparents were from. And we're seeing certain borrowed words into French from others, specifically a lot of the time North African languages, and we see them coming into standard French today. I know that you work a lot in cinema in this sort of multilingualism and code switching world. And I loved this quote from Claire Riffard, who's a researcher at the CNRS, and she wrote that the very notion of francophonie presupposes the underground presence of other languages. Is this something that you sort of perceive in your work? And how do you analyze that in terms of this value judgment and this purity that the French have historically sought so often for their language?
That's beautifully put. Yeah, part of what's so interesting about the Francophonie with a capital F, the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie, is it's founded on this assumption that the French language is an important element of life in all these various countries, but that these countries are fundamentally multilingual, largely due to colonization, the presence of French alongside Arabic, alongside Berber languages in, North African countries, for example. But these are countries that have been multilingual for centuries, and prior to colonization, these are sort of fundamentally hybrid spaces. And it's only really recently that the interest and the value of that has become more visible in literature and cinema and culture more broadly. But it's not just happening in these francophone countries other than France. Part of what is so exciting about multilingual cinema and literature coming out of France is that we're being shown the fact that not only has France impacted and influenced so much of the rest of the world with its language and culture in often highly violent ways, but France itself has also been impacted and influenced by the cultures of these countries, and that has only increased post decolonization in many parts of the world as immigration to France has increased. So, like you mentioned, there are so many elements of contemporary French that are influenced by English, like you mentioned before, but also by Arabic. And we see sort of different multilingual dynamics in many different French spaces. And literature and cinema and other sort of cultural productions are becoming more and more aware of that. And so we're getting more multilingual cultural production, which is really exciting to see.
And do you get the impression that most French people today still want to retain a certain level of, again, super air quotes, purity to their language? Or do you think that there's an openness and I mean, just by point of comparison, English has about 4 times as many words as French because we're so open and elastic to new words and to borrowing. French resists borrowing, but it's starting to happen. We're seeing it. I mean, you have words like, just off the top of my head, you have like a lot of French people will say toubib for the doctor, and that's an Arabic word. Wesh is borrowed from Arabic. You have these words that are being borrowed into French and are becoming part of the nationally recognized jargon. It's not being used by one subset of people in the way that, like, New Yorican Spanish would be, where like a certain population will speak that way. You have just all sorts of people using these borrowed words all of a sudden. Is that something that you think that basically is French becoming more elastic, do you think?
I like that question. I'm an eternal optimist, even though I do find myself constantly talking about colonial violence. I do still feel like there is a lot of potential for the French language to open up. And even if there is a real reverence for traditional institutions like the Académie Française, and, there have been these sort of almost comical attempts in the past to resist largely English words entering the French language. Like, ordinateur is a really good example of a refusal to allow computer to become a French word. In the way that we've adopted so much technological jargon from English straight into French as these devices are invented. We sort of laugh a little bit at the almost quaint resistance to those kinds of new forms of vocabulary. But I mean, French has been also adopting into sort of mainstream French terms that have come from French slang as well. So there are like multiple layers of French dialect and variation within the French language that maybe some French people are not particularly aware of. For example, the incorporation of verlan words into standard French, words like beurre, which are, of course, slang terms that flip words around. So instead of arabe, people would say beurre, and that term has really become, I would say, I don't know if the Académie Française has accepted beurre yet. I'd have to check, but it's a word that you can reasonably use in everyday French and expect people to understand you. So I don't know. I think there's perhaps increased resistance, like you say, than in places like the US, but there is absolutely an increased opening up, but also a history of this happening.
Well, that's very exciting. And I mean, especially because, in the world in which a lot of your research takes place, I mean, you're looking at cinema, at art and literature is often where the examination of these sort of nascent changes is most felt. So you might have a better inside look at what's really happening and what might be happening down the line by looking at sort of the kinds of films and the kinds of characters and the kinds of French experiences that people are choosing to talk about on screen. Is there anything that you're noticing in terms of like the big French Francophonie kind of inserting itself or being welcomed into the French cinema space right now?
I think that the French cinema space is generally a few steps ahead of broader cultural norms. So I think I have to be aware of that when I haven't lived in France for a few years now, and obviously haven't been able to visit since I saw you last, was it January, February, just before everything happened. And so I have to be aware of the fact that my current contact with metropolitan France is mostly through its films and the French people I know living here. And it is a sort of perhaps a privileged, radical space in which it's perhaps more acceptable to experiment with representations that go against the norm. There's perhaps greater care being taken to represent minorities in a lot of the films that I'm looking at. And so I'm sort of living in this world where this exciting kind of investigation is occurring. And in many ways that filters through to French culture, and it is also a reflection of French culture. But I notice the difference most when I step back into my kind of secondary research area, which is representations of colonialism and multiculturalism in French museums. And the difference that I notice between the representations of multilingualism and multiculturalism in low-budget indie films and extremely expensive, centralized official institutions like museums it's really quite a remarkable change. So sometimes I step back into museum studies as a reminder of how far we have to come.
We'll be right back with Navigating the French after a word from our sponsors.
Marie, should I find an apartment before I move to Paris?
Well,
What's a tenant file and a guarantor? Do I need them?
depends.
I just bought an apartment. What should I do with it?
Congratulations. Something to think about our...
Is it better to rent my apartment furnished or unfurnished? How do I set my rental rates?
Gail, these are all great questions, but the answers may not be so simple. Perhaps it's better to tune into our new podcast, Paris, a State of Mind.
Oh, that's a great idea. I'm Gail Boisclair.
And I'm Marie Pistinier.
Between us, we have more than 35 years of experience in real estate and rental services. Listen in as we answer all your burning queries.
You can even submit your own questions for us to answer.
Paris, a State of Mind. Mondays on Paris Underground Radio.
And now, back to Navigating the French.
Well, okay, let's chat a little bit about that, because so you said that film is sort of a couple of steps ahead, and I'm really interested to know if there's any film in particular that you've seen recently that's touching on this in a particularly exciting or revolutionary way. And then museums wise, I think I know what you're getting at, but do you have an example of a museum that you think still has quite a bit of work to do in terms of its approach towards this issue of Francophonie?
I think you probably know what my main example is going to be, and I don't mean it as a criticism, or it is a criticism, but it doesn't make me have to throw the museum in the bin. It's a very interesting institution, but the Institut du Monde Arabe in the Quartier Latin, the 5th arrondissement. So the Arab World Institute. It's one of the largest museums dedicated to the Arabic-speaking world. So by Arab world, they're sort of meaning the Arabic version of the Francophonie, unless you want to view France as an Arabic-speaking country, which would also be completely feasible. But what's really interesting and to me very disturbing about this museum is that it's dedicated to this highly diverse part of the world, spanning across, North Africa and the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And there is no mention of French colonialism in North Africa or the Middle East, Lebanon, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco. There is no reference to this history, to the interlacing of the French language and the Arabic language across these many spaces. And there's no conceptualization of France as an Arabic-speaking space in any part of the museum. And so to me, it seems like, it's really interesting that France would invest in such a prominent, expensive, important cultural institution right on the banks of the Seine in a highly sort of visible part of the city, and yet not engage at all with the interlaced histories of France and the Arab world. So, certain museums do a better job at acknowledging those interlaced histories, but I think the IMA is a really good example of what the norm is, or at least has been, in France.
All right, so we've got some work to do.
Yeah, a little.
And is there a film that you've seen recently that's sort of showing you what could be possible? I mean, it is a little bit of a prediction, but is there a film you've seen recently that's showing you what could be possible, what's starting to happen in French culture in terms of embracing these other Francophone nations or identities?
There are many, but one that I'm thinking of that I actually just covered with my students in a Cinéma Monde course that we've just finished is a small documentary from 2017 by Mam Fatou Niang and by her colleague Katie Nielsen called Marianne Noire. I don't know if you've had a chance to see this one.
Not yet.
I highly recommend it. It's it's a relatively simple, low-budget documentary in which Mam speaks with 7 Afro-French women about their experience of being a Black woman in France. And so Mom's chosen these women for their diversity of experiences and also their diversity of professions. So there's a dancer and a chef and a filmmaker, another academic, a hairdresser, which is a really important part of the film, talking about the politics of Black hair and beauty. But what's really interesting about this film is that one of the questions they're asked is, when did you realize you were Black? And so each woman had a story of being forced to consider their Blackness in metropolitan France. But they're also asked about how they conceive of their identity. So some women say, I'm French. Je suis française. And others say, well, I didn't realize that I wasn't Senegalese until I went to Senegal and I realized, oh no, actually I'm not Senegalese, but I'm not fully French either, because when I'm in France, people don't consider me to be French. And what's really striking is that none of these women have come to the same conclusion about their multicultural, multilingual, francophone identity, but they've all been forced to consider it throughout their lives. And so it's quite a hopeful film, despite some pretty heavy content. But it's a very graceful examination of these issues of Frenchness, what it means to be French in France, and if you don't correspond to the norm of that, what your experience of being Francophone is like. So it's a really beautiful film. Marianne Noire.
Okay. Yeah, that I haven't seen that film yet, but I'm definitely going to take a look. And it reminds me of a lot of the narratives that we're hearing around anyone who's got their foot into cultures. First generation Americans, for example, you're hearing a lot of this sort of, where do I fit? I read an essay, and now I'm forgetting the name of the person who wrote it, about how she grew up in the United States as a Korean American, went to Korea, and it was like very clear to the Koreans that she was not Korean. And so that whole bridging the gap. But in France specifically, it also reminds me of when the French won the World Cup. And so many of the players were of African origin, which is another word I would definitely like to talk about on this podcast, which is d'origine, d'Origine. And Gemma's laughing because obviously that's a very thinly veiled way of saying, essentially, when you say d'origine whatever, it means that you're French, but basically you're French, but you're something else. You're not French since Charlemagne, basically. And so you had all of these players who were mostly Black or brown. And when it was an American, and I'm not going to remember who it was, maybe you remember, Gemma, who said Africa won the World Cup for France.
It was Trevor Noah, so it was a South African American.
That's right. And that made it so much more interesting. So Trevor Noah said Africa won the World Cup for France. And the French players of African origin, but they were French, said, no, I'm French. They claimed their Frenchness and they refused that hyphenization of their identities.
Yes, which is highly different to the American norm, right? Where it's much more normalized to describe yourself as, Mexican American or Korean American. And in Marianne Noire, there is like a reclaiming of the hyphenized identity as a valid way of describing oneself. So Mame Fatou Niang, the filmmaker herself, is really quite militant about describing herself as Afro-French and rejecting other conceptions of her identity. But it's quite radical. In France, it's a universalist society. So the concept of this égalité in the liberté, égalité, fraternité is that it doesn't matter where you've come from, it doesn't matter what you look like, it doesn't matter what language you speak at home. If you're French, you're French. And of course, that is intended as an inclusive thing, but it does also filter through to discouraging people from claiming other identities. And I think we saw that with the World Cup. These players wanting to claim their Frenchness, which is absolutely, of course, valid, but really rejecting an idea that they would have an African identity as well.
Absolutely. I mean, and that égalité is definitely a concept that we're going to be exploring a lot on this podcast. It was kind of the crux of my work at the Sorbonne is examining, you had the new French Republic, and they were founding themselves on these joint ideas of liberty and equality. And you can't have both always. And they decided that when in doubt, equality first. And it meant that you had this very universalist culture. You had everybody gets the same everything. So it's true equality and not necessarily equity. And it does mean that the space for racial justice, the space for feminism, the space for queer rights, the space for gender rights has looked very different in France as opposed to in the United States, for example.
My students like to describe it sometimes as perhaps being 20 years behind, especially in terms of queer rights. Like many of them chose to write their final essays on either BPM, 120 battements par minute, or Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, which are two queer films that have come out in the last couple of years. And they really struggled with the vocabulary for queer cinema when writing in French. We ended up deciding that we'd call it cinéma queer in italics because there really isn't a vocabulary for it in French yet beyond adopting the word from English. And so, it doesn't mean that radical films and radical texts and progressive debates don't come out of that space, but it is interesting to note that the language is perhaps a couple of decades behind.
And yet another way that we need French, or we're waiting for French, or hoping that French becomes a little more elastic in the next couple years, or, faster if possible.
Indeed.
Gemma, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me about Francophonie today. I've had so much fun.
Me too.
And I hope that you'll come back. Before we go, I just have one last question for you. What is your favorite word in French?
My favorite word in French? Oh, gosh, I don't know. I mean, everybody loves pamplemousse, right? But no, I mean, I really am. Despite the criticisms that I've come to this conversation with, I really do love terms like francophonie that allow for an opening up of the conversation about cultural diversity. So I love Mum's Afro-French. I love francophonie with a lowercase f that comprises France and the French-speaking world without a binary division. I love cinéma monde for that reason too. But really, I just love this vocabulary that we have for talking about cultural difference in French. Because even if it is still mildly taboo, the language is there to have that conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gemma.
Thank you, Emily. This was super fun.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.